Not every rise begins with a spotlight. Some begin in heat, smoke, and the kind of exhaustion nobody romanticizes later. Before the stage lights, before the cameras, before people called her sweet, bright, effortless. Rainbow Shoe was just a girl helping her family survive. And that matters more than the polished version of her story people usually remember, because when the public looks at someone like her, they often see the smile first, the softness, the easy charm. What they miss is the pressure that taught that smile how to stay in place. Rainbow Shoe, born Xu Mengjie, was born in Jinhua, Zhejiang, China in 1994, and from the age of 12 she was already helping her parents run their barbecue restaurant. In other words, long before fame turned her into an image, life had already turned her into someone who knew how to work. That is where her story becomes more interesting than her image, because idols are often introduced to the public as if they simply appeared, camera-ready, lovable, almost unreal. But people like Rainbow Shoe only become compelling when you rewind far enough to see what existed before the packaging. The girl behind the later rainbow persona was not built inside a perfect entertainment machine. She came from routine, labor, and a life where helping your family was not a sentimental detail for interviews. It was normal, it was expected, it was survival. And maybe that is why there has always been something stronger underneath her sweetness than people first assumed. When she entered entertainment, it did not happen with a dramatic breakthrough. It started the slower way so many careers do, through training, uncertainty, and the quiet fear of trying very hard while almost nobody knows your name. In 2015, she joined the girl group project Lady Bees, and for a while that was the shape of the dream. Small, unstable, but still alive. She ranked first in the group's only election, which already hinted at something important. She had presence and she had endurance. But in this industry, endurance does not guarantee safety. Lady Bees eventually disbanded, and that early chapter could easily have become the end of her story. Just another girl who got close and then disappeared. But Rainbow Shoe did not disappear. She became sharper. In 2018, she entered Produce 101 China, a survival show built to turn ambition into public spectacle. These shows do not just test talent, they test nerves. They turn every ranking into suspense, every moment into narrative, every week into a question. Who is rising? Who is slipping? Who is about to be forgotten? And Rainbow Shoe was not presented as the obvious chosen one. She was not the girl everyone expected to debut from the beginning. She was something more fragile and, in a strange way, more dramatic, a dark horse. She spent most of the competition hovering outside the debut line, never securely inside the final top 11 until the very end. That made her rise feel less like a victory lap and more like a fight the audience was watching in real time. And that is the part people tend to flatten when they tell her story too quickly. Because she debuted sounds clean. What actually happened was tension, uncertainty, the kind of climb where one bad week can erase months of effort. Then came the finale. Rainbow Shoe finished 11th, the final debut spot, and entered Rocket Girls 101. Not from the center, not from the safest place, from the edge. And maybe that detail says more about her than anything else. She did not walk into fame through the front door, she slipped in at the exact moment it almost closed. Rocket Girls 101 debuted in June 2018 and remained active until 2020, giving her the kind of visibility that can change a life, but also the kind that comes with an expiration date already attached. So by the time the public began seeing Rainbow Shoe as bright, charming, and easy to love, she had already lived through something rougher than the image suggested. That is what makes her worth watching. People saw the sweetness and assumed ease. They saw the smile, but not the strain behind it. And that misunderstanding would matter later, because once an image is fixed, every rumor, every whisper, every shift in public attention hits harder. And with Rainbow Shoe, that gap between image and reality would become the real story. Fame did not make Rainbow Shoe safer. It only made her easier to watch. That is the part people forget about survival show success. The debut is dramatic, but what comes after is usually more dangerous. Once Rocket Girls 101 was formed, Rainbow Shoe was no longer fighting to be seen. Now she had to prove she deserved to stay visible. She had entered the group in the final debut spot, which meant her success already carried tension inside it. She was in, but not from the center. Chosen, but not untouchable. Fame does not arrive as comfort. It arrives as pressure with better lighting. During the Rocket Girls era, the image around Rainbow Shoe became easy for the public to consume. She was sweet, bright, playful. The girl with the smile people remembered first. That image helped her. In entertainment, softness sells fast, but it also creates a trap. The moment the public decides who you are, it stops looking for anything deeper. The more lovable her image became, the easier it was for people to mistake that image for her entire story. Then came the hidden countdown, built into every project group. Rocket Girls 101 was never meant to last forever, and when that chapter ended, the real test began. From the outside, those endings always look neat. One era closes, another begins. In reality, it is messier than that. A group can give you momentum and attention, but once it disappears, it also takes away the structure that made your visibility feel secure. Suddenly, the question changes. Not can she debut, but can she survive alone? That is where many idol stories start to crack. Because the industry loves a rise more than it loves stability. It celebrates the explosion, then watches closely to see how quickly that same name can fade. Rainbow Shoe stepped into that uncertainty at the exact moment the public had already grown comfortable with a very specific version of her. To many people, she was still the sweet girl, the cheerful one, the easy one to like. But solo visibility is cruel in a different way. In a group, attention is shared. Alone, every weakness feels brighter. And still, she did not disappear. She kept moving through music, variety work, and acting, trying to build a second identity beyond the first. That kind of transition is rarely loud at the beginning. It is slower than people expect and often underestimated. A dramatic comeback makes headlines. A gradual reinvention does not. But over time, a different kind of attention began to gather around her, and with attention came something less flattering than admiration: scrutiny. Because once the public feels attached to a certain version of you, it starts treating that version like property. For Rainbow Shoe, that version was the soft, lovable image people had already fixed in their minds. So when discussion around her appearance began to grow, the reaction felt bigger than it should have been. It was never just about a face, never just about a smile. It was about ownership. People were comparing the woman in front of them to the version they had already decided to keep. That is when celebrity stops being simple admiration and starts becoming surveillance. By then, Rainbow Shoe was no longer just a former idol with a hard-earned rise and a bright public image. She was becoming a person caught between who she really was and who people preferred her to remain. Once a celebrity enters that space, rumors no longer feel random. They start to feel inevitable. Because the public always watches more closely when a girl it once thought was simple begins to look more complicated than expected. That is the strange thing about soft images. They do not protect you. They simply make the public more shocked when the story turns. By the time Rainbow Shoe reached this stage of her career, people were no longer just watching her work. They were watching her as an idea. The sweet girl, the bright one, the face that felt safe, approachable, almost too harmless to become the center of messy conversation. And that is exactly why the rumors landed the way they did. Not because they were the darkest rumors in celebrity culture, not because they exposed some dramatic collapse, but because even a small shift feels louder when the public has already convinced itself it knows who you are. For Rainbow Shoe, that shift came through romance rumors. When her name began circulating in discussions about actor Wu Junting, the reaction was immediate. Online attention moved fast, as it always does when people think they have found a crack in a familiar image. Photos, speculation, fan edits, comments dissecting body language, reposts framing ordinary closeness as hidden truth. Suddenly, the conversation around Rainbow Shoe was no longer just about career, image, or growth. It became about possibility, about whether the girl people had kept inside a neat, lovable frame had a private life more complicated than they expected. And that is always what fascinates the public most, not the rumor itself, but the collapse of certainty. Because celebrity gossip is rarely about love, it is about control. Fans and casual viewers alike build versions of public figures in their heads, then panic the moment reality refuses to stay inside the shape they created. In Rainbow Shoe's case, the rumor hit a particularly sensitive point. She had spent years being seen as soft, cheerful, almost emotionally transparent. The image felt open, clean, easy to read. So the possibility of a hidden romance did not just create curiosity, it created tension. Suddenly, people were forced to confront the possibility that they had never actually known her at all. That is where the real drama begins, not in whether the rumor was true, not in the paparazzi language, the screenshots, or the endless guessing, but in the public reaction to the idea that Rainbow Shoe might have a self that existed completely outside what fans were allowed to access. The internet has a habit of treating female celebrities like emotional property. People do not just admire them, they quietly expect them to remain legible, available, consistent. They want the same smile, the same softness, the same carefully preserved version of innocence. And once that illusion starts to shake, even slightly, every glance becomes evidence. Every silence becomes suspicious. Rainbow Shoe never needed a major scandal to enter that kind of scrutiny. She only needed the public to realize she was more private than they wanted. That, in some ways, is more unsettling to audiences than a louder controversy. A scandal can be consumed quickly. It burns, peaks, then fades. Mystery lasts longer. Ambiguity keeps people staring. And Rainbow Shoe's story fits that pattern perfectly. She does not have the kind of public collapse that turns a career into chaos overnight. What she has is something quieter, and in its own way more revealing. A career built on sweetness, then shadowed by the moment people started looking for the hidden parts behind it. Which is why her story was never really about one rumor. It was about the distance between image and reality. Between the girl the public thought was simple and the woman they slowly realized they could not fully read. Rainbow Shoe rose through hard work, survived the instability of idol culture, outlasted the countdown of a temporary group, and kept rebuilding herself under a gaze that only grew more demanding with time. That alone would have been enough to make her interesting. But the rumor changed the angle. It made people look again, closer, harder. And once that happens, a celebrity is never seen the same way twice. Because sometimes the most revealing drama is not the one that destroys an image. It is the one that proves the image was never the whole story. The truth is, Rainbow Shoe was never the kind of celebrity built for a spectacular public collapse. And maybe that is exactly why her story lingers. There was no single explosion, no career-ending scandal, no one moment so dramatic that it erased everything before it. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways more revealing. The public looked at her for years and thought they understood her. They saw the smile, the softness, the bright, easy charm. They built a version of Rainbow Shoe that felt simple enough to admire without questioning too much. Then time did what time always does. It complicated the picture. That is what adulthood does to an idol image. It exposes the difference between what was marketable and what was real. By the time people started circling her name through rumors, appearance changes, and whispered questions about her private life, the real shift had already happened. Rainbow Shoe was no longer just being watched as a former survival show success or a sweet-faced idol who made it through the final debut line. She was being watched as a woman the public could no longer read as easily as before. And once that happens, the story changes forever. Because the audience is usually comfortable with a girl who feels open. What it does not know how to handle is a woman who keeps part of herself locked away. That is why the later attention around Rainbow Shoe felt bigger than the events themselves. Not because the rumors were the darkest. Not because the controversy was the loudest, but because they disrupted the illusion. They reminded people that she had always been more layered than the image they first fell for. More private, more difficult to define, more real than the brand built around her. And maybe that is the most honest ending her story could have. Not a downfall, not a scandal-driven collapse, but a slow correction. A reminder that the public had been looking at the polished version for too long and mistaking it for the whole person. A reminder that sweetness does not mean simplicity, that a soft image can still hide endurance, pressure, ambition, and a life the audience was never fully invited into. Rainbow Shoe did not become interesting because everything fell apart. She became interesting because it did not. Because she kept going, kept adjusting, kept surviving the way so many public figures do, under pressure, under projection, under the weight of being misunderstood in a way that looked flattering from the outside. And in the end, maybe that was the real story all along. Not the rumor, not the image, not even the fame, but the gap between what people saw in Rainbow Shoe and who she had quietly been the entire time.